Alan, can you hear him?
No.
I can hear
Enda, you just went mute.
There we go. We're live again. It's almost as if I haven't been doing the show for a couple of weeks and I'm out of practice. We'll start that again. This is the Huddle Breakdown. We are the podcast that look at the stats, XG, and performance of Celtic. I'm Enda Call, the person who's supposed to be running the show, the producer, and who's supposed to know how to put us live with all the mics going. But I messed that up. It's an international week, so you can excuse me for that. We're going to be doing something a little bit different on the show this evening. We're going to be doing a sort of mid-season rating of where Celtic are at and what we have improved on since the last international break and what we're going to improve on after this one as well. To do so, I am joined on the line, as always, by Alan Morrison, Celtic by Numbers, and by Jaco James as well. Guys, you held the ship well in my absence last week and probably improved on things, to be honest, by the looks of it.
You know what? Actually, I have a confession to make up front. Number one, I'm the reason why we're starting 5 minutes late, so I apologize. Number two, I one-upped you Enda last week, and I haven't had a chance to inform Alan of this, but this is a good disclosure based off of any analysis I'm going to do today, meaning that you should ignore me, is the reason I had a mic problem last week was because I didn't have it on. I never turn it off. And I share this workspace with my teenage daughter who does a bunch of stuff for school and all kinds of different things. And immediately, the a-hole parent, I assumed that she had done something to my setup and assumed my detective work should start there. And in fact, it was my stupidity. So I apologize to my daughter, and I apologize to all of the listeners and Alan for having a horrible mic last week because of my sheer stupidity.
Yeah, the sad truth is that nobody noticed.
We're all learning here. Listen, we're going to be doing that mid-season rating in a little while, but we're going to start with the news of the week. And I know some people will be wondering why we're covering this, but I mean, we have to cover the biggest news of the week, and that is that Steven Gerrard has left Rangers. He's gone to Aston Villa to become the manager. He's taken Michael Beale with him as part of his coaching staff. And suddenly, Rangers are going into the next half the season without a manager so far. Giovanni Van Bronckhorst is the person who is being egged on as the current favourite. There's also rumours that Alex Neil is in the running for the job as well. So, guys, I guess we'll get your instant reaction to this. This is sort of Brendan Rodgers-esque in a way, not to the same extent where Brendan Rodgers was, it was further on the season. But what are your thoughts on Steven Gerrard leaving Rangers, and then on what impact that might have on them?
Go ahead, Alan.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be, I think for them, it's going to be hugely impactful. It has to be, right? This is an incredibly disruptive event. Whatever you think about the merits or otherwise of Gerrard as a manager, what I would say is that over the last 3 years, they've been an improving team, and they're a team which, as I've said many times, and I've meant it sincerely as a compliment, are incredibly well organized, well drilled, well coached side. And to have the whole of the backroom team, including people like Beale, who's very highly regarded, to all walk away is going to be definitely very highly disruptive. So I think that's the good news for Celtic, if you like, because again, trying to attract anybody, players or manager mid-season is always problematic. All the good people are in jobs, and the season's not even we're not even at the stage where people either are giving up on European places and still in cups and all that sort of thing. So it's going to be very difficult to prize people away, especially if you don't have a lot of money necessarily to pay compensation, etc. So massive disruption. I suppose that they've got the same players. I'm sure they won't change radically how they play. They've got a big squad and a strong squad, so it probably won't have a massive impact in the immediate term. I'm sure they'll get themselves well motivated for a cup semi-final. But yeah, massive disruption. It has to be. It's a hugely disruptive event at this point in the season.
James, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with Alan. I think that the what I can maybe add is going back to my old analogies as far as system dynamics, and this is a test for their system. You know, how robust is their organizational structure? How robust is their decision making? You know, to use the Rodgers scenario as an analogy, we saw Celtic respond to that shock in a way that over the intermediate term probably turned out to be not the wisest. So, you know, when the shock hits the system, the question is, okay, how resilient is it? So, are they going to have, you know, are they going to make a reasonably smart decision given the factors that Alan mentioned? You know, are they going to go for, you know, some would joke, a staunch candidate that's, you know, that knows the city, again, to use the analogy, or are they going to go with someone who's going to be a consistent continuation of the style of play, you know, kind of what you would expect given that they've adopted the director of football model with Wilson and whatnot. So that's what I expect. I mean, I think somebody like GVB makes sense within that context. He's available. They won't have to pay for him. You know, it's not like his resume is completely devoid of success. At Feyenoord, he had some good success. He seemed to play a similar style. So that seems coherent to me. The other thing I'll add is I think, generally speaking, I wrote about this in a thread once the news became final, is I think, generally speaking, the importance of managers are overstated. Meaning that, of course, they're important. But we've talked about the manager as God model and how that's sport has moved away from that, not only in football's slower, but in a lot of other sports like basketball, hockey, baseball. So in the era of analytics and data and information, they tend to be an instrument of deploying the intelligence of the organization, shall we say. So they're part of that process, a vital, important part of that process with as far as man management, emotional intelligence, you know, getting players to perform well within that context. And on the margins, things like tactics and that kind of thing. So that's where I think, you know, Beal and Gerrard, to me, were competent, proficient, but nothing special, as most managers aren't. There are very few Contes and, you know, managers that are true difference makers. You know, they're kind of heterodox on the wings of the distribution, so to speak, of truly brilliant managers. So, you know, it's going to be disruptive if they make smart decisions. I don't think it'll be hugely disruptive over the intermediate term. And the last thing I'll say is that it does create additional resources for them, whatever the reports are, 4 million or whatever it is. Every million counts as we're heading into a transfer window that may end up being hugely important, not only for us, but for them relative to the competitive balance in the last 5 months of the season. So there's a lot of risk with it, but there could be some quote unquote upside. I mean, if they replace Gerrard and Beal with someone who's at least in the ballpark of, and the whole team, McAllister or whatever, and the transition period isn't destructive, then they might actually have some extra money to reinforce the playing squad, which again, analytically, that may actually be more important than a difference between Beal and GVB. You know, if they go out and sign some stud center back, given the state of their center back situation right now, that may have a bigger impact versus, you know, Gerrard, GVB. I lied. One more thing. Their fixture list is pretty tough. So between now and the end of the season, end of the year with the big derby, they've got to go away to harder fixtures like Livingston. I think they have to go to Hearts. They may even have to go to Hibs
and Aberdeen.
And Aberdeen, right. So the fixture, you know, we got the tough end of the draw in the first round, and then it flipped here in the second round. So this adjustment period and transition, all these things that Alan rightly pointed out, could be amplified within that context as well, because they, you know, December's always tough. They've got some European fixtures in there, and now, you know, the away fixtures in the league. So it's going to be fascinating in my mind. Again, a huge test for the resiliency of their structure.
Yeah, look, there's a lot of sort of different points that we can hit on with this. The first point I would make is on Van Bronckhorst himself. Just the right enough amount of bastard in him to be the Rangers manager, and enough of a personality on the pitch to have me automatically dislike him as soon as he is the Rangers manager. Secondly, the fixture list is very important as well going into this. I was talking on the Monday breakdown about sort of markers within the season, and the next marker for Celtic is that derby match. There's 8 games between now and then. If this disrupts Rangers for 2 to 3 fixtures and Celtic continue on the form that they've been on, they could be within 1 point or even ahead of Rangers by the time that game comes around, which could be a turning point within the season. And then finally, the money point of view is a very interesting one, because I mean, Steven Gerrard was brought in to do one thing and one thing only: stop the 10 in a row. They've spent an extortion amount of money to do that. They haven't replaced that money with anything. I know the accounts were broken down by Swiss Ramble there, and like compared to Celtic, it's absolutely incomparable when it comes to the amount of money coming into the club for players. So and then on the flip side of that, if you take away the fact that players are assets and actual human beings, a lot of those players have come to the club for Steven Gerrard and may not want to continue within that club without Steven Gerrard as the manager. So I can't see how it would not have an impact of some sort in terms of their season. And if it disrupts them enough to have Celtic either on level points or ahead of them by the time that derby match comes around, I think it really is it's sort of a swing state in America, if you want to look at it from a sort of a campaign point of view. That's where I see it. We will park Steven Gerrard now, because this is a Celtic podcast.
Allegedly.
Allegedly. We dive into a few other things as well. Sometimes there's weird avant-garde art references that you make, James, and I have no idea what you're talking about most of the time, but I pretend I do, and I smile and nod. Yeah. Let's touch on something that has been discussed over the last couple of weeks, and that is Jota and whether Celtic should make him a permanent signing. 6.5 million it would cost to make him a permanent signing, and I'm going to lay my cards on the table right now. I do think Celtic should sign him. I think I've seen enough of him as a player in multiple competitions to say I believe Celtic should sign him. James, you were writing differently in the Celtic Way during the week, so lay your cards on the table. Explain to us why you think it might be a risk.
Right. So let me first preface this by saying that he's been tremendous. I enjoy watching him as a fan. I mean, the entertainment value and his performance levels have been really good, particularly in attack. My point is more a top-down organizational one. I mean, if we think of this from how are Celtic going to build a team that's of a level that I think most of us want, which is truly competing at the European level along with our peer group, the Portos, the Benficas, even ignoring kind of that next rung of Ajax and Salzburg, is I think there's certain organizational type decisions that we've got to make. And one of them is tilting more towards optimizing resources. So I think within that context, I think a question is, well, is signing someone like Jota's profile, as good as he's been, and as good as he probably will be if we sign him permanently, is that good enough from an optimization perspective? And I think that's where the risks come in and the questions come in. So the other thing I've done is kind of benchmark his performance so far. So I think the first thing that we need to do when you're looking at this kind of thing is he's been good, but okay, well, how good? What does that mean? What's the context? Right? What's his age? What's his likely development curve going to be? What's his likely resale value going to be within that context? So all those things fit within kind of the organizational structure. His fit with Ange's system is another component to all of this, right? So I compared him to Kyogo because in my mind, Kyogo checks a lot of those boxes. He doesn't really check the age one. He's a little old for our model, right? So that's, I think, partly why we got him for the price that we did. And an issue in the Japanese market, given their culture and how, how late players there tend to kind of get first team game time, it appears. And I've all learned in the last 6 months, 5-6 months, that I didn't know anything about before. So the market's moving towards valuing younger players higher. So like 18, 19, that's where the premium money's going, right? That's how an Ajax and a Salzburg are outperforming, because they're spending their $6.5 million on 18-year-olds. They're not spending it on 22, 23-year-olds, right? That's when they're selling their players. So that's a question structurally, right? So we've already gone old in the modern game with Starfelt, with Kyogo, obviously with Hart. I mean, if you look at the transfer window, the only one that would even theoretically fit that model is Abada, right? So he's coming at 19. He's now 20. Okay, so that's the only one that kind of fits with that. It's kind of a premium prospect where you're outlaying real money to pipeline high-end talent, like a Edouard was when he came in, or like a Frimpong was when he came in. So that kind of a higher tier of talent, getting it earlier. The next part is benchmarking his performance. So he's basically been somewhat comparable to kind of peak Forest, kind of 18, 19 Forest, and a little bit below what Sinclair was, let's say, in 16, 17. Okay, as if you measure that relative to just kind of like, as Alan would call it, scoring contribution, XG and XA, that kind of thing. And I do it in various ways. If you just kind of take the number, but then if you also take it as a percentage of the output of the team, because that kind of normalizes a little bit for style of play, right? Because the 18-19 Rodgers team was not as all-out attack as, let's say, this season so far has been for under Ange. So there's all kinds of different ways to normalize these things and take a look. And there's no question he's been very good. The question is it good enough given his fit, given all those other strategic things that I've talked about? Mm-hmm. Is the upside and payback going to be enough, right? Would I rather have two 18-year-olds at $3 million that maybe fit Ange's system a little bit better? And I think the big issue there is pressing so far. So that's kind of the thought process. It has nothing to do with whether he's a good player or not. He's objectively a good player.
So can I hop in and ask a question here just on that? Is your worry that he won't develop enough for us to get enough value out of him when we eventually sell him on? Because let's face it, that's the idea of what Celtic have been doing, that it wouldn't be worth taking the risk on the 6.5 million. You're thinking the value of return wouldn't be high enough. Is that your general point?
I mean, we could let's say we sign him at 6.5 and we sell him for 15. Is that good or bad? It is what it is. It's not the kind of outlier move in value that our peer group is enjoying, right? When they spend 6.5 on an 18-year-old, they sell them for 50 or 40, right? So it's a scaling issue. It's what's the upside? Do I think he's going to go for 40 million? No. The other part of that is who's the counterparty? And I talked about this before. When we sold Frimpong, he went to Leverkusen. When we sold Klimala, who's had a good season, by the way, because I watched him some on Red Bull New York, he went to Red Bull. Ayer went to Brentford. And in each of those cases, those are relatively smart teams. So who would we be buying Jota from? Well, it would be from one of the teams that were supposedly trying to ascend as a peer, and they're selling him for some reason. I don't know what it is. I mean, I would think Benfica probably know him better than I do, and they've decided that he's surplus, and he hasn't played there much. So I'm not saying that means he isn't good enough. I'm saying that's context, right? So when I add all of these things together, I think that means the probability. And I always think in probabilities. None of these things are black and white. It's what's the likelihood that he's going to be a 25, 30 million pound kind of sale in 2 years, I think is pretty unlikely. Could we make good money on him? Sure. But again, to me, that's not us optimizing. Now, the last thing I'll say is, given the state of Celtic, the recruitment team, how recruiting has been going, I don't, this is largely an intellectual conversation because, I take him, given the circumstances right now, over another McCarthy, over another Abada. Again, the decision making in the process I'd rather have another Jota than another Abada. So there's a lot of nuance to my argument here. It's just if we're going to be a club that gets to that level, I think this is the kind of decision that's reflective of why we're not there yet, and that this isn't one that I would make, and I don't think a team like most of our peer group that we're aspiring to be would make. And in fact, one of those is on the counterparty side of this decision, potentially selling him to us.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not going to run with the headline to say that you think Jota is terrible and that
that would be absurd.
Yeah. Alan, do you want to hop in on this? What's your general thoughts? My first inkling on this is that potentially the context of the league has to be taken into account here, that of course Ajax and the rest of them are able to sell for 40 million because their league is respected a lot higher than the SPFL. And it's, Celtic have to produce a Kieran Tierney to get 30 million. And Kieran Tierney, if he's an Ajax player, might go for 50 million,
So, based on the argument that it's not optimal for that model, we are nowhere near operating to that model. Okay, so the Celtic are hugely successful in the context of Scottish football in selling talent over the last probably 10 years. Probably because of the proximity to the English market and the disdain with which Scottish football is held, we've probably not got as much money for the likes of Van Dijk and Wanyama than perhaps we would have done had we been in, I don't know, Belgium, let's say. But nevertheless, in the context of Scottish football, there's never been, and it doesn't look like they're going to be a comparator for the success Celtic have had in being able to sell players and make a profit, and therefore, plug revenue gaps, if you can call it a gap, through not having Champions League football whilst continuing to kind of grow the football club. Having said all that, we're absolutely nowhere near the model that James talks about that you would see in place at Ajax and Benfica. We're years away from that, and I agree that should be our aspiration, and that's what we should grow towards. But we're at least 40 million a year in revenue short of where we would need to be operating at the level that they're operating, where they can buy 3 or 4 18-year-olds for 5 million a year and take a punt that one of them will turn into a 50 million player. We're nowhere near that. So we're going to have to, up our game again in terms of revenue somehow, and we're going to have to completely put coaching and recruitment and so forth and analysis in place that will unearth these and attract them to Scotland. And it's going to be a multi-year process to get that up and running. In the meantime, we've got to build a squad, and the squad is very thin and we're very short of talent. Now, to James's point about Benfica being a counterparty, not wanting to betray any confidences, but my understanding is Benfica have screwed up. Okay, somewhere something's gone wrong. There's no way this kid should be available for the money that he's available for. My very simple take on this, and you said it yourself, James, is if we pay 6.5 million today, we've got at least a 15 million player on our books tomorrow. And in the context of Scottish football, you'd always take that move. You'd always take that move. You'd be mad not to. We paid 9 million for Edouard. In normal times, we probably would have got 25 million for him had it not been for COVID and his contract situation. And I think we're looking at a similar kind of level of talent for considerably less money than what we paid for Edouard. He's still relatively young, 22. I did exactly the same as you did. I benchmarked him against actually Forest and El Unisi. I looked at Forest and El Unisi, and I looked at the 1920 season because that was a good season. That was probably peak Forest actually. So comparing a 22-year-old Jota with a 25-year-old El Unisi and a 28-year-old Forest at the peak of his powers, he stands up pretty well. There's really nothing in most of the metrics, and he actually is well ahead. He's nearly at Frimpong levels of elite ball progression with the ball at his feet. Frimpong had that one super skill, that one superpower that got him a £13 million move. Jota's also got that superpower, but he's got other very strong attributes as well. His overall scoring contribution that James mentioned, which is assists plus goals, would although he doesn't look like he's going to be as prolific as Forrest. Got 16 goals that season. El Yunusi, as we know, was a good finisher. But if you add in goals and assists, expected goals and expected assists, El Yunusi is nudging towards 0.9 a game, which is higher than both of them. For context, Edouard was generally around one and a bit, around about where Kyogo is. So that for a winger, a creative winger, that's pretty good. Secondary assists, he's also very high on. His packing stats are blow the others out the water. And one of his great attributes is his ability to get on the ball. So one of the problems that you see, I think, is not ever been a strength of Forest's, and is definitely a weakness in Abada's, is his ability to get on the ball. Is his movement good enough to create space for himself? And then when he does create space, is his control and body strength good enough to maintain possession? Jota, it is. He might have nice hair, nice teeth, and a nice little metrosexual goatee going on, but he's actually quite a strong guy. His body strength is good. His balance is excellent. His speed is good. But his super strength, to me, and he comes out on top of all of the wide attacking players that we've had, is his ability to get on the ball. And as we know, when he gets on the ball, he creates chaos. He gives the ball away a lot. He gives up more crosses. He loses more passes than all of those players because he puts risk into the game. We've talked about this over and over again. When you've got a midfield like Celtic have got now, of McGregor, Turnbull, Bitton, these are all safe players. Okay, you need players in the final third that are going to put risk into the game, and he does that in abundance, but he does it successfully as well. I think this is and forget the numbers. I just think he's a special player.
Right. So yeah. I'll rebut in two ways. First is that this is where I think system matters. So it's hard to normalize players that play in different systems, different managers, that type of different styles, that type of thing. So, for example, Forrest in 1819 versus Forrest in 1920. So just from again, this is analytical point and a conversational point, which is, okay, take Jota and compare him to an El Yunusi. How would El Yunusi produce in Ange's system this season? It's a theoretical question, right? But yeah. he we saw how much Christie kind of exploded with his output in a system that amplified his strengths. The second part that I wanted to mention, and I meant to mention this in my first my direct before the cross examination here, is one of the areas that I think football and analytics is still very virginal is on the defensive side. And quite frankly, that's not surprising. Even in baseball, it really hasn't been until the last 5 years, despite Moneyball being 20 years old now. It's really the last 5 years where baseball has exploded into defensive analytics. And that's been due to, the analogy with football is off the ball stuff, right? How do you quantify space and defend? Because defending is so much about space as opposed to event data. And I think probably the best proxy that we have for that. Well, first of all, before I get there, defense is a huge part of the game, right? So how do you value that, and how do you quantify and measure that and that contribution, not only as an individual, but the network effect of team defending? And that's where in hockey, basketball, they're probably a better direct analogy to football because of the fluidity of the game. And I think another issue for Jota is this is why I think Kyogo is the best analogy. Is Jota is not in the same planet as Kyogo as far as that side of the ball, and Kyogo's to me, that's what makes Kyogo an outlier signing. I mean, that you're getting the kind of attacking output that Jota's performing and offering, and you're getting elite defending and pressing in that position. And that's where I think, from a systemic perspective, if we get, three Kyogo's up front. You know, and that's where this Maeda guy, the rumor of him coming in potentially, where that seems to be one of his strengths. So this is the qualitative part of it, because we don't have great analytics there right now. The best I can come off of is looking at some pressure data and stats off of StatsBomb, and I don't have access to their off the ball metric called OBV because it's too expensive and I don't have access to it yet. But the way I can kind of infer things, you know, Jota is at best an average player in that regard within the context of Ange's system, where that's amplified, meaning that the importance of that aspect of his position in Ange's system, it's not the same as playing on a counterattacking team, where the balance of his, you know, the value of defense versus attack is tilted more towards kind of sitting back defensively. So going forward and defending from the front, creating chances off of that defending, I think is vitally important to Ange's system, the way I understand it to be. Kyogo fits that to a brilliant degree, and Jota doesn't. And again, so that's, you know, kind of my final argument, which is, in my mind, if we're going to have, you know, kind of the top signing, because that would be at $6.5 million. To me, you get, you know, a 19-year-old who can play that way, who's optimal. You know, basically look at Abada's age profile, but someone who can finish and press and can dribble and beat players off the dribble. Find those type of players, spend this $4, $5, $6 million on that kind of profile. You're going to, in Ange's system, because we've seen it with Abada, if they have the skill set at that age, they're still going to be able to produce at a European level. And then you also get the asymmetry of the higher potential sale value on the flip side. So because again, this comes back to a system thing too. I mean, we've seen this. I mean, I think that's part of why, and we'll talk about this in the next segment. That's part of why Ange has changed how we're playing, is because we're not defending from the front, and the midfield is not pressing in his system the way, and we don't have a sweeper keeper, right? So he's a really smart guy. So he's done a lot of smart things to tweak the system to optimize more for the talent that he has. So to me, it'll be interesting. You know, I don't really take managers saying, "Yeah, we want a player." I mean, they're never going to come out and say, "I don't want a player," right? I mean, that's not the way these things work. So I think it'll be interesting to see if they do sign him permanently, because to me, given everything I've read about Ange, I don't think he fits Ange's profile of the player that he would sign as the big time key position for his system.
So James, I mean, normally I'm with you, but I just think you're miles off on this one. I really do.
That's why I'm heterodox.
Yeah. So could you also, what I've found doing the Celtic by numbers thing, because obviously, as people may or may not know, probably do know by now, I collect my own data. I try and use the same definitions I opt to use wherever I can. I got my own some bespoke stuff, but generally speaking, I create my own data. The benefit of that is to be able to benchmark Celtic players through the years. Now, what I've found in looking at various different, mainly through trying to work out, do players play better in Europe or not, that type of conversation, what I found is that the standard of the opposition is by far the most predictive element in terms of how a player will perform, more so than any system or formation. Now, caveat that with, I think in certain cases with certain individuals, it clearly does matter. And Shane Duffy, that Enda and I were talking about before the show, certainly fits into that. You know, on an individual basis, the way he was asked to play, given his skill set, wasn't conducive to getting the best performance out of him. But generally speaking, if you want to see, if you see how as a player is created more chances, scored more goals, etc., the quality of the opposition will be the most important aspect, over and above who the manager was and whether it was 4-3-3 or 4-2-3-1. So I don't accept that is a reason for not signing Jota. And secondly, every player is a trade-off, right? You're going to make a trade-off for whoever you sign. Celtic are not in the market for buying the finished article at 18 that has got 15 plus out of 20 on every attribute on FIFA or whatever it is, or Championship Manager, right? It's just not going to happen. It doesn't work like that. This is a guy who's got, potentially elite level attributes in the most difficult part of the game, which is creating chances and scoring, right? That is the hardest thing to do. If we had an attack that consisted of 3 Kyogo clones, we wouldn't score any goals because there would be nobody to create the chances. It's not how you can't build a football team like that. And then when you think, the last point is when you look at the context of the team that we have today, okay, we do not have enough risk-taking creativity. I'm not going to say we don't have enough creativity. That's not accurate. We don't have enough risk-taking creativity in the side with the midfield that we've got, and Jota gives us that in abundance. And I think he's crucial to the way that the team is playing and to the success we're having in an attacking third so far this season.
Mm-hmm. Final point on this, James?
Yeah, I agree with all of that. My point is more so, I shouldn't say I agree with all of that. I agree with his importance in attack. Where I would disagree is I don't think there's anything unique about him. I think he's, a very good player in that regard. But as Sinclair's 16-17 season in the Champions League at a much higher level against better teams was better than what Jota's been doing at a.
But he was 29. He was 29 years old.
Oh no, I agree.
He was at the absolute peak of his career. He was at his peak.
I don't disagree with that. But let me just finish the second point, which is I'm looking at it now. So StatsBomb benchmarks all kinds of stuff statistically. So within the Europa League, so far, and I run all kinds of radars relative to attack and defending and pressing and all that stuff. So far in his a little over 9 games, he's 24th percentile in possession adjusted interceptions. He is 82nd percentile in tackles, but he's only 27th percentile in defending dribblers. And he is 52nd percentile in pressures, possession adjusted pressures.
He's average. I'd accept that.
Right. So that's
but it's a bit like the same argument as saying, we'll sign a goalkeeper who's great at crosses because lots of teams in the SPFL ping crosses in. If that was the case, we would keep Barkas because Barkas is the best goalkeeper at defending crosses, right? Now, pressures and regains, if you look across the metrics for a game, are a relatively small part of the game. I'm not demeaning the importance of it and the importance of style and what Postecoglou was trying to do. And I accept and I completely agree that Jota is at best average at that aspect. But that's the balance. That's the trade-off with him. Now what is compounding it is that neither McGregor, Turnbull, Rogic, Bitton are very good at that aspect of the game either. So it's a systemic problem that Celtic have. If we had players in the midfield like Christie who could do that part of the game well, the trade-off with Jota would be an absolute no-brainer, right?
I agree with that. I mean, you have that luxury if you have the systemic part that allows you to overweight part of your allocation of resources, let's say, to an outlier attacking player. Meaning that if you're going to have a luxury player, and I don't think Jota is that. I mean, I think he's proficient enough defensively. So it's a balance. But let me just read off the example of Kyogo. So Kyogo's 93rd percentile defending against dribblers, and 97th percentile in possession adjusted pressures. Right. So those are just 2 examples of that to me, to your point, Alan, they're low percentage, but because we don't have great off the ball or spatial statistics, to me, those are logical proxies for players that are using space in a way in pressing that are dynamic and they're going to create problems for the opposition. And to your point, I think part of the reason, I think this is maybe a good segue, and I know you're trying to move us along here as the good host that you are, as Alan and I are duking it out here, is if you look at XG conceded so far, and this is before we play our 2 of our harder games in the Europa League group, it's not much lower than it was last season in the debacle that was the Europa League group last season. The difference is that we're creating twice the amount of chances, right? So again, the value of this attack versus defending, and doing it at a European level. So I think Jota's, and again, this is not a hill I'm going to die on, right? So like I said, if they sign Jota, this is why I qualified. I mean, given the state of Celtic right now, if they sign Jota, I think it's going to be a less than optimal decision. But way better than the vast majority of decisions that have made. And there's, but it's that issue of at a European level, are we going to be able to defend front to back and create the attacking? And I think the pieces of that, I go back to my Jenga analogy all the time, is having those pieces shaped properly. And to your point out, if we have 3 stud midfielders who are Ange ball midfielders, then you can get away with a Jota in 1 or 2 of the spots up front. But we don't. So that's
it does. So last little point, it doesn't help that we keep ending up in a group with at least 2 top 5 league opponents.
Right.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Yep.
Well, that's what happens when your seating drops where Celtic is. Unfortunately, I'm gonna be the moderator and say that was a draw. I'm still on Team Jota. I still think Celtic should sign him. And I think, look, although this is a stats show, and I'm not disregarding the pressing stats, James, but I think if we get to the end of the season and Jota has 14 goals, 8 assists, Ange isn't going to be wondering if he's in the top percentile of pressing. I think he's going to see him as a real attacking threat and sign him. We are going to talk about the season so far. So this is sort of the last break that we have until 2022, because that's when the next international break is. So we want to do sort of a mid-season. I know it's not exactly mid-season, but we want to do a sort of a ratings of where we're at so far. So I'll just rattle through the sort of thirds of the season so far, if you take it by the international breaks. The first third was the initial one. So we started the season by a loss to Hearts, then we won 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 games in a row, then losing to AZ Alkmaar and lost to Rangers in the first derby of the season. The second period of the season was where we started to see a little bit of a struggle. Came off the break with a 3-0 win to Ross County, then lost to Betis, lost to Livingston, won the game against Wraith Rovers, drew to Dundee United, lost to Leverkusen, and then won to Aberdeen. And then since the last international break, unbeaten in 7 games, 6 wins, 1 draw, started to pick up results again. And what that means for Celtic is that they're second in the league, 4 points behind Rangers. League form, 1-8, lost 3, drew 2. Scored 30, conceded 9. Both of those are the best in the league so far. And then Europa League form is 1-2, lost 2, scored 8, conceded 10. And then individual stats, it goes Kyogo, top goal scorer, 10 goals, 1 assist in 14 games. Jota, the aforementioned Jota, 6 goals, 6 assists, 14 games. And then David Turnbull is third in the list with 5 goals, 5 assists in his 17 games so far this season. So, Alan, we'll start with you. We're going to take this sort of in the different positions and how they're performing. So creative stats, things like that. So where do you want to kick us off?
So I think the most striking change since the last international break has been in defence, in general, defending as a team, right? Expected goals against has halved. Okay. Now, again, small samples, there's some outliers. So that obviously in the previous, not included in the last set of games, was away games in Betis and home to Leverkusen, difficult games. Alkmaar was also a difficult game. We had the as James has said, we had the hardest possible run of league fixtures in terms of away matches and away venues. So you absolutely got to put all that into context as well. But having said all that, to halve your expected goals against compared to the defensive shambles really that started the season, I think is a pretty strong strong indication of progress, right? And it was pretty much evident straight away in that game against Motherwell that suddenly we looked like a coherent, organised team. The praise that was giving to what Gerrard and Bale had done at Ibrox around, they just simply look competently organised. The spacing is good on the pitch. They're all running together. They're maintaining their distances. They're maintaining their alignment. Their defensive shape is looking organised. That's what I'm looking at. That's what I'm looking for. That's the basics really. And we do not associate Celtic with that over the last certainly 18 months or so. And that was starting to be there now. That time on the training ground in the international break didn't look like it had been wasted. And it was broadly the same set of players. I think as I said before, you've got a lad that we thought was never going to make it, Ralston. We've got a lad who's on loan and has been punted out every season. He's been at Spurs, doesn't seem to be wanted by them. We've got Starfelt, who everyone's been on the back of and been making mistakes and seemingly had a difficult time settling. And we've got Juranovic, who's playing out of position. That doesn't suggest a great back four, okay? But somehow out of that, he's alchemized. And again, it comes back to system, as we've said before. A much more secure, a much more solid, organized system. You'll see now that we are pressing more intelligently, because again, a press isn't just everybody run after the ball whenever we lose it. A press is usually trigger based, event based, and it's a response, and it has to be at the team level. Right, so it takes, to do pressing properly, it takes a lot of organisation, a lot of communication, a lot of drilling, and a lot of awareness and across the team. We're starting to see that happening on a more selective basis, and then when the team isn't pressing, it's falling back into a coherent sort of mid-level block shape, which is pretty solid, orientated to limit space in the centre of the field. These are all good signs to me that things are moving in the right direction from a defensive perspective. Clearly he hasn't been able to do anything about the personnel, although bringing back the likes of Bitton, and if we'd said at the beginning of the season that Ralston, Bitton, and Roderick would be some of the mainstays of Celtic's progress so far, we would all have had a right good laugh at that. So that's the big thing I would focus on for this last sort of third, as you positioned it. And our actual expected goals for has gone down in that period. So maybe there's been a conscious effort to solidify, really. And again, given that we've actually probably had, I wouldn't say easier run of games, although we've played Dundee, obviously, who are desperately poor. We've played St Johnstone, Hibs, Livingston, Motherwell. Ferencváros. They're all pretty decent sides. So is it a worry? No, because we know that Postecoglou's teams are always going to attack. We know we've scored lots of goals. Our expected goals differential in the league is over 2. I think I'm right in saying, I think it's over two a game. Now that when we talk about that, why is that important? James and I have spoken, and it's probably I might do a little bit of work on this as to what is the right answer. But if you're down near one XG per game differential, even if it's on your side, like you're outscoring on XG the opposition by 1 a game, you're still in the realms of where variance can screw you up on occasion. And if you're under 1, then variance can have a big impact over the long term. So if you're over 2, you can absorb some bad things happening, right? You can absorb the odd sending off, the odd injury, etc. So I think Celtic are in a really strong place. All the metrics, underlying metrics at the league level, SPFL level, suggest Celtic are by a distance the best attacking team in the league, by a huge distance. Defensively, we're getting better, and that's the big positive I'd take from the last third.
Yeah, well, what's interesting is when you're going week by week on the narrative of things and how the press is reporting things and how social media is reacting, you would have imagined Celtic would be absolutely awful in defence. But I was actually quite surprised to see that Celtic have conceded the least amount of goals in the league this year so far. They've conceded 4 less
and
goals.
It's not an outlier. I mean, our XG and our goals against are pretty much the same.
Yeah. So I mean, it definitely hasn't been the disastrous gung ho football that Ange needs to change to adjust to the Scottish League. I mean, they're best in the league defensively, best in the league going forward. So the idea of that would imagine that a couple of weeks down the line, Celtic might actually be top of the table, depending on what happens on the other side. James, the progression of Celtic over the last 10 weeks, and what you've been noticing, the change in the team and what they're doing differently.
Yeah, echo a lot of what Alan said. I think I'd be curious, Alan, do you think, obviously the specific details are a little different, but to me, the composition of where we've been the last 6 weeks is almost like the Rodgers 18-19 team. Meaning that more controlled, more possession, not as intense pressing. I mean, that Rodgers side really dialed back, more of a mid block. And I think that's the analogy I've been using, is that we've gone from quote unquote Ange ball with the wrong pieces. Our Jenga tower was collapsing too much. And I think, to his credit and his team's credit, they have adjusted. So people talk about pragmatism. I think that he has very smartly adjusted within the context of his available resources. Because I've referenced this before. I wrote a piece, I think back in September, about volatility, and back to Alan's point, not only that spread of XG, but as you allow more. I mean, let's say you had 3 XG on average and you were conceding 1, that's worse than 2.5 versus 0.5, right? So the more you can limit your opposition's chances is as important, or maybe even a little bit more important, than what that spread is between relative. And I think I'll echo what Alan said. On a season-wide basis, our XG differentials, I think, is up around 2, but it has been coming down as we have kind of gotten this more controlled game. So the defense has improved, but we've kind of taken a hit on the attacking side because we're not as aggressive and, frantic and pressing as much and all of this other stuff. The Ange ball has been dialed back. But that probably means we're less vulnerable to dropping points if we can keep that spread as wide. Now, my concern has been the trend in open play XG. So what's been happening is, and I talked about this kind of emergent trend that I've been worried about for about 8 weeks now, and it's become more persistent, meaning that as it's come down, we've been moving more towards, kind of 1.5, and it's kind of slowly coming down closer to 1.4 in open chance or open play chance creation. And if we keep kind of leaking, we're Rangers have kind of been creeping up on that side. And again, the caveat, as we talked out at the Open, who knows what's going to happen with them now, but they had kind of been getting better in that regard, and we had kind of been coming down, and to the point where we were so far out in front of everyone else in the early part of the season with the randomness and chaos that was going around. It averaged out. We were really, really good. And as we've tamped down on the crazy, we've been coming closer, and they've been so. The relativeness of that relationship, I think, has become more stable. And that means, when you're the underdog, quote unquote, meaning that we're trailing by 4 points, if things kind of stay status quo from here, that you almost need to take risks at some point, potentially. So that's why I think between now and the end of the year, with this transition at Rangers, the relative fixture list, I mean, to me, this is hugely important, how this all shakes out in the next 6 weeks, because we really do need to capitalize on this period. I think people talk about we need to stay close or, around this area. I think we need to close the gap and, go into that game either at parity or even ahead a little bit. And I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think we will. I think that eventually will happen. And I do think my thoughts on that were before Steven Gerrard left the club, that if Celtic could get parity by that game, then they'd have a good chance of winning the league. I think Celtic have a chance now to capitalize and go ahead, because, I mean, all it has to be is Rangers to drop, lose one game, Celtic win that game, it's down to 1. Suddenly, in the space of a week, you can swing it and you can be ahead. The one thing I would offer to perhaps give an explanation to the drop in the amount of XG you're conceding, and also the sort of lack of, I'm not sure what the word you used there, was in my head, but the randomness of the team and how they're going to perform. Yeah. Volatility is the word you use. Yeah. I was just skimming through the results and the starting lineups. In the last, since the last international fixture, Celtic have been a very steady starting lineup with 1-2 changes max throughout. It might have been, Juranovic at left back as opposed to, Greg Taylor, who was out injured, or Giacomakis started the game against Livingston instead of Kyogo. Those kind of little small details, little 1 or 2 changes. Compare that with the start of the season, where the back four, you didn't know what the back four was going to be week on week. It was 3 to 4 changes throughout the entire team. You know, Christie was there for a while. Now Christie was gone. Edouard was still there for a while. Edouard was gone. Ayer gone. All these players were moving in and out of the team. Joe Hart came into the team. Juranovic came into the team. Carter Vickers wasn't there for a long time. So finally Celtic have their starting lineup that they can trust, that they can get like consistency throughout it. We're seeing Starfelt settle into the team with Carter Vickers beside him, and relationships are starting to build. And like, I guess that was always going to happen with a team that had a turnover of 11 players at the start of the season, 12. Yep. So that's where we're at. I think we're finally at the stage of the season now where we know our starting lineup, we know the best starting lineup, we know who we can trust, and we know who we can, who's going to get the results from us. And I think that's where we're seeing the improvements.
I think that's spot on. I think we need to keep coming back to this, Enda, because, you know, as Charlie Mulgrew said on the Sky Sports, he said, you know, when a player comes in, doesn't matter which country it's from, Japan, Belgium, whatever, you know, on average, it's just an average, it'll take about 6 months for that player to settle. Okay, we've brought in 12 new players, okay, and we're not 6 months in yet, and yet some of them have settled in terms of their performance on the field. I don't know what's happening off the field. I presume that if they're performing on the field, hopefully they're happy off it, but we don't know. But you know, I would say it's remarkable to assimilate that number of players, especially young players who have come a long way and would be expected to have bedded, taken time to bed in. To get that level of coherence, I think, is remarkable, and I think we shouldn't forget that, and we should absolutely keep coming back to that point. I just wanted to chuck in a couple of numbers. Just actually, as I was bashing James earlier, I feel like I should support him now. So the expected, just the first thing, I think you made an excellent point about, and again, this speaks to something I've hinted at with Postecoglou being a pragmatist. Actually, he's not a zealot in terms of the way he plays. That was a misinterpretation.
Yeah,
I think
you were out on front on that. Yep.
And you know, before Motherwell game, so before the last international breaks, averaging 520 passes, completed passes. That's open play passes per 90 minutes. It's now up to 600. That's a significant increase, and it all speaks to that control. And it is that is up to Rodgers-esque levels of control that the team are now exhibiting, as opposed to 525. You drop that by another 20, you're kind of into Dyla territory, or certainly more into sort of Lennon territory in terms of style of play. And then the second one, just to back up and put into numbers what James said, is if you look at open play expected assists, so the quality of chances being created in open play, was averaging 2.2 per game, 2.2 XG per game from expected assists. It's now down to 1.6. So there is something definitely there to keep an eye on. But if it is trending that way, more so the need for players like Jota.
Right. Yeah, and I guess that's the big question for me is how do, and we've talked about this on prior shows recently, is if the formula that the opposition starts to settle on is deep, narrow blocks. We saw a similar challenge with Rodgers in that 18-19 season with this kind of more deliberate build-up. And you know, the issue there becomes where our vulnerability has emerged in defending has been in crosses. And if you get teams that have any proficiency in countering, you know, Dundee is such a bad team, but they do have a little bit of quality in attack. You know, as ridiculous as Charlie Adams is, almost like a cartoon character in my mind at this point, he can pass the ball. You know what I mean? Like he's decent at picking out a pass and, you know, progressing the ball. So they at least, I mean, Motherwell in midfield is almost, you know, in that regard, almost useless, right? So it's that dialing of, you know, Dundee is so terrible defensively and so poorly organized and disciplined and athletically that we just ripped them apart. And it didn't really matter that we gave up a couple of decent chances. When you get to that threshold of a team that's going to be more organized, and I don't think it's St. Johnstone. St. Johnstone, you know, they really miss the quality of players that they've lost. I mean, their underlying stats. I'm talking about coming up the semifinal. I suspect it's not going to be St. Johnstone going forward either. But there's a threshold there with a Dundee United or some of these other, even St. Mirren, where if they decide to play that kind of narrow, low block and try to hit us on the counter from wide, which is where we concede it with crosses, that and we're having trouble breaking down. Like that's the concern I have as far as what's the formula where we're going to drop points at any kind of level that's problematic, is those kind of teams deciding to go, not come in and have a go, but come in and be a little bit more cynical and pragmatic and say, okay, we're going to play it tight, we're going to play it deep, and then hit them on the counter. And hopefully they don't. Hopefully they do what Dundee did when they came in last time, and we did draw, but I mean, we lit them up. I mean, it was like over 3 in XG for us, and that was one of those outlier games where we just didn't win the game, even though we really probably should have. As opposed to like the Livingston game where it's Chinese water torture trying to break teams down.
Yeah, Charlie Adam, he's an advertisement for hair plugs, for the dentist, and for moisturizer all in one, because he is the oldest looking 35-year-old you're ever going to come across. The man is, God almighty, he's out of shape. And the Anthony Ralston shoulder before the Jota assist is
the face plant. I love a good face plant.
It is definitely my favorite moment of the season. Incredible stuff. Before we finish up then, anything else you just want to highlight from the season so far and what you are expecting from the next couple of weeks?
I'll just say, I mean, quality of management, decision making. I mean, again, to Alan's point, I mean, I think having a manager with what I think is real intellectual firepower within the context of controlling a team and setting up a team, and I think we've definitely gone back towards more of a Rodgers level, where we're talking not only competent but potentially, I talk about managers not mattering that much. I think we have a decent shot at another manager here who is out on that right tail, meaning that, does really make a difference in ability to get. And that's what we heard. That's what we all heard from all of our Australian friends and some of the friends in Japan that have covered him, is that he could be special. And I think so far, I feel better about that likelihood, having experienced the last 5 months. So to me, that's the most important thing, is that we seem to have someone in place that's, a real outlier potentially.
Yeah, I agree. I'd love to see another 2 weeks on the training ground, with unhindered. I mean, we don't actually have that many players away on international duty this time. Maybe 6, I think, first team players, maybe 5, 6, and so that extra time, because it looks like to me huge strides forward in the 2 weeks that he had with the team before. Another 2 weeks on the back of what already been a much markedly improved set of coherent performances. Be fascinated to see how he starts to improve the midfield, because again the midfield is where the problems start and end in terms of the two things that James consistently and rightly highlights around the poor pressing and the diminishing of creativity. That's really the key area for me. And if he can put Bitton onto a game, he's literally can turn water into wine.
Well, let's hope so. Thank you to everyone who has dropped a comment, by the way. Apologies that we haven't really got to any of them, but I wanted to let the lads free on their Jota debate. So I promise you I will get to those comments in the next show. But that's all we have time for on this week's Huddle Breakdown. If you want to get the podcast, it's available on iTunes and on Spotify and wherever you get your podcast, really. You can get them on our Twitter account at Huddle Breakdown. And if you're watching on YouTube, there are more videos as well that do pop up on the channel. So hit the subscribe button below and you'll get notified every time one goes live. James, Allen, thanks for now.
Cheers, guys. Go Scotland.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Forgot Scotland are playing tonight. Go Scotland. Right. Cheers. Good luck.